Welcome to Green and Gold FC.
And then poked home by Tim Cahill. Australia have done it! From right the Matildas into history. Cue the party. The best team of the A-League era. And it goes. Oh! It's a save that means the world to Australia.
Welcome to Green and Gold FC. We have a special Australia Cup themed episode, and I'm joined by South Melbourne Mike and South Melbourne Pete of Twitter fame. How are you going, Mike?
I'm well, Graham. It's great to see you again, and thanks for inviting me on.
How are you going, Pete?
Very well, although it's a typical Melbourne day today on the day of the Australia Cup draw, but other than that, doing great.
Alrighty, so let's look at the draw we have so far, and it seems to me we've already had a lot of cup sets. We have only 4 Foundation 8 clubs, and we have only 4 clubs which are topping their league at the moment. All the others have been knocked out. Can you take us through that?
I think it's fantastic. It just shows there is a lot of depth of clubs across Australia. There's a lot of quality clubs. The NPLs are very competitive leagues. The fact we've got, clubs from outside their top divisions qualifying from their states as well. It just shows there's a real renaissance going on at local club football or state league football, where any club could reach the Australia Cup, and there is a lot of competition to reach the heights of potentially a second division and maybe in the future a third division, and I think it's to be celebrated. And that's the beauty of the Cup, is that any day anyone can win and anyone can qualify and progress as far as they like.
Yeah, and I guess just building on Pete's points there, like when I look at the teams, the 32 teams that are in this year's Cup, I really think it's a good mix of there's A-League teams in there. There's some powerful NPL teams, and quite surprisingly, like even some teams from lower tiers as well, which I think is really reflective of the spirit of the tournament. You want to give a national opportunity to clubs who may have not experienced it. And I'll give you the example. It's maybe I'm skipping far ahead, but I look at the tie of Darwin Olympic versus Nunawading, and I think that's a perfect example. Maybe Darwin Olympic have been on this stage before, but I know Nunawading haven't. And to have like a VPL2 club, which is the third division of Victoria, versus a team from the Northern Territory, which my understanding is a Northern Territory-based club has not won a match in the Australia Cup. I think that perfectly epitomises what the Australia Cup is about, because we're going to have history created potentially, in that match.
So, speaking of the increased competitiveness we've had lately, I hope this is not a sore spot, but South Melbourne obviously haven't had the most amazing season so far. Is that a sign of things getting more competitive, or is it just an off season? Have you noticed a change in the quality this year?
On this one, look, I don't think, certainly, it goes without saying, the NPL Victoria, and I'm not just going to focus on the NPL Victoria, I'm sure it's the same, in other NPLs, but let's speak about Victoria. Obviously, we're very familiar with that competition. It is a highly competitive league. The professionalism in the league year on year is increasing. The budgets, I guess more importantly, are also going up. Now, specifically to your question about South Melbourne, I think it's a multifaceted question, because it's not normal for a club, for example, to nearly win everything last year, including the Australia Cup. South Melbourne only lost to Macarthur in the semi-finals with a penalty. That was arguably probably not even a penalty in many people's eyes, right? Maybe in some people's eyes it was a penalty. There was only one match South Melbourne didn't play in last year out of all possible matches, is my understanding, and that was the Australia Cup final. To now be in a situation where I think going into the game against the Melbourne Knights, about a month ago, South Melbourne, and the Melbourne Knights were basically equal bottom, and that's where South Melbourne started to sort of revive their season a little bit, and now we're out of the relegation spots. Currently, I'd say we're still in the relegation fight, but I think we got there via a combination of reasons. Yes, competitiveness is one. South Melbourne doesn't have the highest budget in the league. I would estimate South Melbourne probably has a budget of, maybe 4th or 5th, maybe even the 6th highest budget in the NPL. So there's always a risk, from that perspective. I would say the club didn't build on its good season last year in the transfer window in pre-season. Maybe, it makes sense to re-sign all the current players, but when we lost a player like Harrison Sawyer, I would argue that we didn't replace him properly, and he was worth, probably 15 to 20 goals in any given season. So I would say, Graham, it's multifaceted. Hopefully the club now, with the changing coach, also with the transfer window opening up now, with some results starting to be in favour of South Melbourne, I'm not saying we're going to turn the season around fully, but with the draw against South Hobart, we certainly have a great chance of progressing. No disrespect to South Hobart, it's going to be a tough match, but we'd fancy our chances even away from home against South Hobart. What's your view, Pete?
So, Pete,
I think you summed it up perfectly, Mike. As most of you know, Mike and I could talk about South Melbourne until the cows come home. But again, it doesn't take much at this level to fall down. or to, it is so competitive, teams, and that's the beauty of promotion and relegation, right? And this is something the world over, and this is where something, without getting off topic, that football needs at the highest level as well, because it raises the standards. Because if you have one bad year, if you don't train properly, recruit the right players, have too many injuries, whatever it may be, if you take your eye off the ball, you can go down. So right now, clubs like Melbourne Knights and South Melbourne are fighting tooth and bone to stay up, and they're throwing all their resources at it to make sure they try to stay up. And guess what? It also creates a lot more interest. I'm watching a lot more games at the moment because I want to see those clubs that are around us lose so we can get that edge. And it just creates that additional interest. So we haven't experienced this much as South Melbourne supporters over the years. But I'll tell you what, it's definitely got more of my attention than usual for different reasons.
Yeah, and I'll add just one more point. Like with promotion and relegation, which we see obviously in the NPL Victoria system and in many other states, really when your club has a bad year, like if you just survive or you come to the match where you didn't expect to win, but it's an important win, like for example the match against Preston, like that outpouring of emotion when you manage to do that, like it just means so much more. And to be fair, like South Melbourne, I think went 12 or 13 games without a win. Like my general attitude, I wasn't trying to reflect when in my dealings with people on a daily basis, I was trying to hide the fact that I was angry about football. But I could, honestly speaking, my general attitude during that period of 12 to 13 weeks was that it was my feeling was lower, and it's because my football club was losing. And if promotion and relegation didn't exist, those emotions just wouldn't be there.
Turning our attention to the draw, we have 3 potential clashes between second-tier teams, either teams which are Foundation 8 clubs or teams which are topping the NPL. And we have 3 clashes between A-League clubs at the moment. Let's go through them one at a time. Canberra, Croatia is playing Adelaide Metro Stars. Canberra, Croatia is, of course, historically known as a club which produced Ned Zelic and many Socceroos. Metro Stars got voted one of the best clubs in the world for labelled one of the best clubs of the world for good football, which is obviously a great honour. Some massive clubs like Celtic were on that list in terms of the style they play. It's very, very attractive. We also have, look at this, Perth Glory versus Wellington. We have the distance derby. We have your own club, South Melbourne versus South Hobart. We have Newcastle versus Adelaide United, and we have Western United versus Sydney FC. Is any, I guess, none of those are candidates for cupsets because both are in the same division this year. But are there any which are particular rivalries or clashes which you're particularly looking forward to?
Look, from my perspective, Graham, I think the Canberra Croatia versus Metro Stars is an interesting match. I think both clubs are highly competitive, obviously, in their state NPLs. They have showcased ambitions, whether like ambitions, for example, to play higher. Like I know Canberra Croatia and the Metro Stars were in the conversation to be foundation clubs for the Australian Championship is my belief. I'm not sure if they're, submitting RFPs now that process has reopened. Both proud clubs, both high-performing clubs. That's definitely a match that I have my eye on, as I'm sure Pete has his eye on South Hobart versus South Melbourne.
Yeah, I wonder whether the Western United versus Sydney FC game will even go ahead, given some of the rumblings that have been going on at the moment. But I won't go there. But it does pose an interesting question. The first game is still a while away, and if an A-League club like Western United does fold, as has been rumoured, what happens then? But I'll let the powers at the APL and the FA work that one out. What was the other game? Sorry, Graham.
Newcastle Jets, Adelaide United, the distance derby between Perth and Wellington. And then, of course, there's South versus South and Canberra, Croatia versus Metro Stars.
The distance derby is an interesting one. How much do the A-League clubs that live that are placed so far away from the rest of the country, how much do they value playing in the Australia Cup? I mean, on the plus side, they get to play regular games because they don't have anybody else other than the NPL clubs around them to practice with pre-season and they're in their own regular season, so they wouldn't necessarily want to be playing their full strength team against a Glory or a Wellington. But equally, there's a lot of travel involved for them already during the whole season, and how much do they really want to continue travelling through the pre-season? So it'd be interesting to see how strong a lineup they both field for the game, particularly obviously Auckland because the game's in Perth. It'd be interesting to see what happens there and how seriously those clubs take it going into the competition.
Yeah, so on the topic of Adelaide, of Auckland FC and Wellington Phoenix competing in the Australia Cup, that's two spots now going to what effectively, amounts to New Zealand teams. And they are New Zealand teams because I remember looking them up, just trying to understand their squad composition. And it was something like 35 players, last season in the A-League across both squads were New Zealand-based players. So not only, are those spots in the top tier of Australian football, going to New Zealand players, those teams are now basically playing in the Australia Cup as well, which is taking away the opportunity of, in particular, state-based clubs to have that national exposure. So it's not really a dynamic, I think, which is good. It's just the point I thought it worth raising. One match, though, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, Graham, which I think is going to be interesting, is definitely RPA Leichhardt, who are obviously a foundation club, and they're playing Melbourne City. I think RPA Leichhardt, from memory, have had one or two cup sets in the past. They do seem to be a team that when they're playing at home on this stage, it's possible for them to get the result. And I would say, look, we're at a stage now, especially in the round of 32. I'd say it's also the case in the round of 16. I don't know if cup set is the right word because last year in the round of 32, I think it was 3 NPL Victoria clubs beat A-League franchises. And, there's a variety of reasons for that. I think one of them is the increasing professionalism, of the NPL in certain states, probably the preseason position which A-League teams find themselves in. But because of, that combination of factors, I don't know if cupset's the right word, but yeah, certainly RPR, I think, will be eyeing the opportunity to play Melbourne City, to see if they can knock out another A-League team again.
So speaking of cup sets, you mentioned City versus RPU, of course. We have a few other cross-division clashes coming up. So we have Northern Tigers versus Sydney United, which of course Sydney United are a foundation club. We also have SD Raiders versus MacArthur, and we also have a NPL, couple of NPL2 clubs, including one playing Darwin, which should be in the NST this year. Yeah, do you see, what do you think is of course, Peninsula Power is facing Western Sydney Wanderers. What do you see is the most likely, which of these do you think would be the most likely to have cup sets? Whether it's an NPL2 club getting up against an NPL club, NST club going down, or perhaps, as you said, one of these A-League clubs going down?
Look, I would say Peninsula Power versus Western Sydney Wanderers is probably another one where, a cup set may be on. The NPL Queensland, it's known for, in particular, many players leaving Queensland, the top players often coming to Victoria, maybe New South Wales. Peninsula Power have been on this stage before. Again, we've talked about a combination of factors previously, which means NPL teams are increasingly more competitive, I think, in the round of 32 and round of 16. So maybe we might see, a positive result for Peninsula Power versus Western Sydney Wanderers. It wouldn't surprise me. So that's one that stands out for me.
I'm really interested to see Olympic Kingsway. They're doing fantastic in Western Australia. They're top of the NPL table there. They put in a good show last year in the league, and first part of the draw against Melbourne Victory. I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I'm gonna say Olympic Kingsway are going to beat Melbourne Victory. Put your house on it. I reckon that is going to be the big cup set. I think they're going to go there, and my old hometown back in Perth. I think they can do it. I reckon it's a little venue there, and they've got a great support base, and I think they'll be able to pull it off.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Pete. I'll certainly remember that one and have my eye on it. Look, I also have a general comment. I just feel, and maybe this is incorrect, but I feel like, for example, when you have teams which are below the NPL level and they're playing like a high level team, especially if it's an A-League team or even if it's a strong NPL 1 team, I often consider that to be a bit of a mismatch. So I'm curious to see, like I think, for example, a match like SD Raiders versus MacArthur FC, I think that's a bit of a mismatch. So, I would be surprised how competitive SD Raiders might be, but let's see. Also, for example, another similarly, I think, mismatched tie, probably Heidelberg United versus Western Bears. I mean, Heidelberg United this season are flying in the NPL Victoria. My understanding is, they might be training 4 times a week, and you can really see with their automation of play, fitness levels, just their level of football. I would back them pretty much against any A-League opposition at home. And I think Western Bears, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're playing me just confirm here. Yeah, they're playing in Northern New South Wales. So look, I'm not underestimating the Northern New South Wales NPL. I just think that that's a bit of a mismatch, and I expect Heidelberg to win quite easily.
And a correction from my perspective. Olympic Kingsway is second, but they're flying anyway. But back to your point about Heidelberg, it almost pains me to say this, but I reckon if they're playing such good football, and so Avondale, I wouldn't be surprised if one of them two could go all the way to the final this year. You need a bit of luck with a draw. And in football, you always need a bit of luck in a competition. But those two squads, the way they're playing, the quality of footballers in their teams, and the way they're both so well coached, it wouldn't surprise me if either of them two at least got to the semi-final and potentially, if things worked out that way all the way through to the final, that they are playing some fantastic football. And if you're not watching South Melbourne on YouTube or live, I highly recommend you watch those two clubs play, because they play some great football.
Now, you raise a good point, Peter, and just quickly, speaking about Avondale, that's also a tie that I'd be interested in. Avondale versus Sterling Macedonia, who have, surprisingly, I never paid attention to their logo, but they have SMFC on their logo. Now, I put it to you, if that tie was switched and the game was played in Western Australia, that would have been really, really interesting tie for me. I do think Avondale will probably, proceed. I'm not saying comfortably, but if it was switched, it would have been, I think, a really hot and on tie. So that's one that I thought is worth mentioning.
So we've got a few smokies to go the whole way, possibly Heidelberg or, of course, Avondale. And of course, there'll be loyalty to South Melbourne as well from yourselves. But the meta-narrative, of course, about this whole thing is that we have, since the announcement of the national second tier, NPL Victoria YouTube numbers are now up to roughly averaging K. Not sure what is in New South Wales, but I assume it's very similar. Do you have any predictions for the ratings? Could we see ratings which have never been seen before in an FA Cup?
Oh, it's an interesting point, Graham, because the NPL Victoria viewership has gone up, and I do try and do an analysis weekly on that, and what I'm seeing is roughly between 80 to 100,000 aggregate views on average, for the 7 matches, and it could be improved, I think, with scheduling. And that's tremendous growth from the years before. And I did actually speak, because there's a narrative online, hopefully to those listening, they'll find this information of value to them. I did speak to a high-ranking official in Football Victoria. I won't say who it is, out of respect to them. And they mentioned to me, because I just briefly spoke to them, the viewership looks up, and he's like, yeah, it's exploded. He confirmed that. And I go like, sorry, what's your comment on, because there's a narrative online that, maybe there's a lot of Asian viewing related to betting, right? And he gave the example actually of South Melbourne versus Preston, which I think the total views were like, over 50,000 on YouTube. It was also broadcast on other channels like Facebook, and also on Preston's YouTube channel. And I think at one point it had like 7,000 to 8,000 concurrent live viewers. His feedback was, no, in the actual data, most of the viewers were from Melbourne. Right. So I found that information to be quite interesting. And look, how that translates to the Australia Cup, it's hard to say, because, I have seen Football Australia's release today. Some matches will be on YouTube. I think that's going to be really interesting, which matches they put on YouTube. Let's see what sort of viewership they get. Some matches are also going to be exclusive to Paramount Plus, which we won't get any data from. Look, if it's a big tie, if it's a night match, if it's on YouTube, I expect the ratings would be solid. Maybe 10, 20,000 aggregate viewers, maybe higher, which sounds high for YouTube, but I think it's possible, is my view.
Final question. Who you backing to win the whole thing?
Sydney FC's got a track record of winning the trophy, quite frankly, just of winning trophies and so forth. So it's hard to see beyond them. They're always there or thereabouts. And obviously Melbourne City's also a franchise that does very well in all competitions they go into. So if it was going to be an A-League team, I'd say they're the ones to beat. I hope it's not a New Zealand team for the reasons Mike spoke about. It's the Australia Cup. It's not the ANZ Cup. But it'd be great. It'd be great if an NPL team made the final, and even better if they actually went on to win it, because, when Sydney United made the final, they actually played pretty well. They really held their head up high and really competed, and really showcased that the gap between NPL and the A-League is not what many perceived it to be, which may have also helped with some of those viewership numbers as well. People are realising the quality's there at the NPL level. So if it's not going to be an A-League team, I'll stick to what I said earlier. I think an Avondale or a Heidelberg are just playing such fantastic football at the moment, and are so well coached, they could definitely give it a shout.
Yeah, and look from my perspective, I agree with Peter. I will say this though, let's not forget that, whilst we hear the narrative online that, in the early rounds, rounds of 32, 16, maybe the NPL teams are at an advantage against A-League teams. Certainly as the tournament progresses, it flips, right? So, when South Melbourne made the semi-final last year, we lost our star striker to the team we were playing against. We're playing MacArthur. This is like a silly thing. Like, how could Football Australia kind of allow this sort of transfer activity to occur? The week of a match, like of a semi-final match. The other thing is that NPL teams are typically their season's finished by the semi-final stage for 2 to 3 weeks. I put it to you that if there wasn't that sort of discrepancy, I wouldn't be surprised if Heidelberg would go all the way. Honestly, from what I've seen this year, I feel they can beat any team in Australia if they're playing, especially at home, and if they're in proper condition. Which unfortunately, later on in the in the Australia Cup, it's difficult to remain game ready, focused, fit, because you don't have your league. But look, I'll go out on a limb and say this could be the year that we see a non-A-League franchise win it, and I'll say it's Heidelberg. However, as a sneaky chance, based on the fact of how we've gotten here, and that's South Melbourne. We've gotten to this stage, I don't know, it's been a combination of favourable draws combined with unexpected wins where we've come from behind, where we've played poorly, but we've managed to get through. I don't know. I think Heidelberg is my tip. South Melbourne, wouldn't be surprised if this streak continues and maybe we make like another semi-final.
I'm going to hope one of two things happens. I always cheer for the teams which are playing in Asia that year because it gives them a bit of preparation, so they're not going totally in cold. Or hope for one of the NST teams to make it all the way. So I guess hopefully though, if the latter happens, it happens legitimately and not because they get it to the final and meet Western United, who folded as a club. I hope that it's a happy ending for all those involved. Okay, so thank you for joining us, Pete and Mike. That's all we have time for this week. Please join us on the forum, greenandgoldfc.com. We also have, of course, Spotify and YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Please remember to like and subscribe. It really does help us. Until next time, it's bye for now.